Is this some kind of joke? The words, sharp and laced with disdain, cut through the bustling noise of the pier. Lieutenant Miller, his uniform so new it was still stiff at the creases, planted himself squarely in front of the old man. He was young, radiating the kind of unearned confidence that comes from a fresh commission and a rulebook committed to memory. He looked Lawrence Owens up and down, a slow, insulting appraisal that took in the worn tweed jacket, the slightly stooped shoulders and the deep lines etched into a face that had seen more sunrises than the lieutenant had been alive. "Sir, this is a restricted naval installation, and this is the gangway for the USS Courage. I need to see your authorization to board." Lawrence Owens, 89 years old, stood his ground. He wasn't defiant, merely still. His hands, gnarled with age and memory, rested on the handle of a simple wooden cane. His gaze wasn't on the belligerent young officer but on the colossal gray wall of the ship that loomed behind him, its steel hull blotting out a section of the bright blue sky. It was Fleet Week, a day of celebration, of families reuniting, of the public being invited to witness the might and pride of the Navy. For Lawrence, it was supposed to be a homecoming. The lieutenant sighed, a theatrical display of impatience for the growing crowd of sailors and their families who were beginning to bottleneck behind the impromptu confrontation. "Sir, I don't have all day, ID and boarding pass now." Slowly, deliberately, Lawrence reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He withdrew a worn leather wallet, its seams frayed from decades of service. From it, he produced an identification card, yellowed and laminated so many times it was thick as a coin. He handed it over. Lieutenant Miller snatched it, holding it up to the light as if it were a suspected forgery. "Lawrence Owens," he read aloud, a smirk playing on his lips. "Rank, Ensign. This thing expired before my parents were born. This is useless." He tried to hand it back, but Lawrence didn't take it. "That ship," Lawrence said, his voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to be carried on the sea breeze. "I served on her sister ship, the first USS Courage. This is the fourth. They invited me." Miller laughed, a short, ugly bark. "They invited you? I'm the boarding officer, and I can tell you nobody by this name is on my guest list. We have dignitaries, congressmen, active duty families. We don't have an open call for museum exhibits." The insult hung in the salty air. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A young sailor with his wife and child in tow tried to edge around them, but the lieutenant held up a hand, determined to make an example of the old man. He was enjoying the audience, the small sphere of power he was exercising on the sun-drenched pier. "Look, Ensign," Miller said, his tone dripping with condescension as he emphasized the junior rank. "I'm sure you were a real hero in your day. Black and white photos, all that. But today, this is my ship, and without the proper credentials, you aren't setting foot on my gangway. Why don't you go find the VFW hall? I'm sure they have some coffee and donuts for you." Lawrence's calm expression didn't waver, but a deep sadness settled in his eyes. He had traveled over 1,000 miles for this. He had woken before dawn, his old bones aching, and put on his best jacket, the same one he wore to his wife's funeral. He had come to say goodbye, to stand on the deck of a ship that bore the name of his long-lost home and pay his respects to the ghosts who still sailed with him. And he was being blocked by a boy who saw only a number, an age, an inconvenience. The lieutenant, emboldened by the old man's silence, pressed his advantage. "What's this?" he asked, his finger jabbing toward a small, dark object pinned to Lawrence's lapel. It was an odd thing, a misshapen piece of metal, dark and pitted, with a simple pin affixed to the back. It looked like a piece of junk. "You get that for perfect attendance at bingo?" The question, so flippant and cruel, seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. For a split second, the bright, noisy pier vanished from Lawrence's sight. The smell of popcorn and diesel fumes was replaced by the acrid stench of cordite and burning oil. The cheerful chatter of the crowd became the deafening roar of 5-inch guns and the horrifying shriek of incoming shells. He was 22 years old again, standing on the bridge of the first USS Courage, the deck bucking beneath his feet like a wild animal. The sky was not blue but a sickly, smoke-choked orange. He could feel the concussion of a near miss vibrating through his teeth. Standing beside him was Captain Evans, a man he revered, whose face was illuminated by the flash of an explosion. In the chaotic aftermath of that blast, with the ship listing and alarms screaming, the captain had looked at him, his eyes wide with a terrifying mix of pride and fear. He had said something, but the words were lost in the cacophony of battle, a silent testament to a moment forged in fire and chaos. The object on his lapel was from that moment, a piece of the ship's own soul, a fragment of its sacrifice. He blinked, and the vision was gone. He was back on the pier, the sun warm on his face, the smug lieutenant staring at him, waiting for an answer. Lawrence didn't give him one. He simply stood there, a silent monument to a history the boy could never comprehend. The confrontation had now drawn significant attention. The line to board had completely stalled. People were murmuring and phones were starting to emerge. The small black lenses aimed at the drama unfolding at the foot of the gangway. Lieutenant Miller was feeling the pressure, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He had to win this. "That's it," he declared, his voice rising in volume. "You're creating a public disturbance and impeding a naval exercise. I'm going to have you escorted from the premises." He gestured to a pair of master-at-arms, the Navy's military police, who stood nearby, their expressions stern and impartial. "Take this man to the security office. He's done here." But in the crowd, someone had seen and heard enough. Petty Officer Miller, no relation to the lieutenant, was a young man, barely 20 himself, but he was a student of history. He had devoured books about the Pacific Theater, about the great naval battles that had defined the 20th century. When the lieutenant had read the name from the ID card, Lawrence Owens, a switch had flipped in his mind. It was a name he knew, a name spoken with reverence in the halls of the Naval Academy, a name attached to one of the most legendary stories of single-ship heroism in the Navy's entire history. It couldn't be the same man, could it? The petty officer looked at the old man's quiet dignity, his unshakable calm in the face of such humiliating disrespect. He looked at the strange, pitted piece of metal on his lapel. A story from a history lecture surfaced in his memory, a story about a young ensign, a sinking ship, and a piece of shrapnel from an enemy shell. His blood ran cold. While the lieutenant was busy preening for the crowd and summoning the security detail, Petty Officer Miller slipped back through the throng of people, his heart pounding against his ribs. He found a relatively quiet spot behind a supply pallet and fumbled for his phone. He knew he was breaking the chain of command, a sin of the highest order. Going over a commissioned officer's head could get him sent to the worst bilge-scrubbing duty in the fleet, or worse, but he couldn't just stand there. If he was wrong, he was finished. But if he was right, letting this happen would be a stain on the uniform he wore. His hands trembled as he scrolled through his contacts, finding the number for the Admiral's office on the ship. He prayed someone would pick up. "Admiral Blackwood's office." Aide speaking. The voice was crisp and busy. "Sir, this is Petty Officer Second Class Miller," he stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm on the pier at the gangway for the USS Courage. Sir, there is an urgent situation developing." "An urgent situation, Petty Officer?" The aide's tone was skeptical. "What is it?" "It's Lieutenant Miller, the boarding officer, sir. He's refusing entry to a civilian, an elderly veteran. He's having him removed by security right now." There was an audible sigh on the other end of the line. "Petty Officer, I'm sure the lieutenant is following protocol. I can't interrupt the Admiral for a guest list dispute." "Sir, please," Miller pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "You don't understand. The veteran's name. It's Owens, Lawrence Owens." There was a pause. The background noise on the other end of the line seemed to fade away. "Say that name again, Petty Officer." "Owens, sir. Lawrence Owens." The line went silent for a few seconds. Petty Officer Miller held his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. He could hear the faint sound of a door opening and the aide's muffled voice speaking quickly, urgently to someone else. Then the aide was back on the line, his voice completely transformed. It was no longer bored and dismissive, it was filled with a shocking electric alarm. "Petty Officer, where exactly are you? And where is Mr. Owens now?" "He's at the foot of the gangway. The master-at-arms are about to take him away." "You keep him there," the aide commanded, his voice sharp as a blade. "Do not let that man leave the pier. Do whatever you have to do. The Admiral is on his way. I repeat, the Admiral is on his way." The line went dead. Petty Officer Miller stared at his phone, a wave of terror and relief washing over him. He had just thrown a match into a powder keg. Now all he could do was wait for the explosion. Inside the Admiral's spacious stateroom aboard the USS Courage, the atmosphere had gone from calm efficiency to controlled chaos in the space of 30 seconds. Rear Admiral Blackwood, a man known for his unflappable demeanor and a chest full of ribbons that told the story of 35 years of service, had been reviewing title charts for the fleet's departure. His aide, a young but highly competent commander, burst in without knocking, his face pale. "Admiral, I apologize for the interruption, but you need to hear this." Blackwood looked up, annoyed. "This had better be good, Commander." "It's a call from a petty officer on the pier," the aide said, breathless. "There's a boarding dispute. A lieutenant is removing an elderly veteran." The Admiral's eyes narrowed. "And this requires my personal attention." "Why?" The aide swallowed hard. "Sir, the veteran's name is Lawrence Owens." The name hung in the air-conditioned silence of the stateroom. Admiral Blackwood stared at his aide, his mind processing the information. The name was familiar, but from where? A history book, a briefing. Then it clicked. It wasn't just a name, it was a legend, a story they told at Annapolis to teach cadets the meaning of the word courage, a ghost from the Navy's most glorious and terrible past. The Admiral slowly lowered the charts to his desk. The color drained from his face. Owens, he repeated, his voice a disbelieving whisper, as in, the Battle of Samar, that Lawrence Owens. The petty officer seems to think so, sir. The Admiral shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the deck. The unflappable commander was gone, replaced by a man galvanized by a profound sense of urgency and horror. Dear God in heaven, what is happening on my pier? He didn't wait for an answer. Commander, get the Marine Honor Guard, full dress, meet me at the main gangway 2 minutes ago. Get the ship's captain. I want every officer on that pier to witness this. Move. The aide practically sprinted from the room, shouting orders into his radio. Admiral Blackwood strode to his closet, grabbing his formal jacket and his admiral's cover. His mind raced. Lawrence Owens, alive, and being humiliated on his watch. It was an unthinkable stain, a sacrilege against the very soul of the Navy. Down on the pier, Lieutenant Miller's moment of triumph was at hand. The two master-at-arms had reached Lawrence Owens, their presence large and intimidating. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a grim expression, spoke in a low, respectful tone that stood in stark contrast to the lieutenant's. "Sir, we need you to come with us, please." Lawrence simply nodded, a weary resignation settling over him. He had expected this. The world had moved on, and there was little room left for old ghosts. "See," Lieutenant Miller said to the crowd, his arms spread wide as if presenting a magic trick. "This is what happens when you don't follow the rules. It's for everyone's safety." He then took a step forward and committed his final, irrevocable error. He placed his hand on Lawrence's shoulder to steer him away, a gesture of patronizing authority that crossed the line from verbal condescension to physical disrespect. "All right, Grandpa, let's go. Time for your nap." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was one thing to be rude, but to put hands on the frail-looking old man was another thing entirely. But before the master-at-arms could lead Lawrence away, a sound cut through the air, sharp and powerful. "Stand fast." The command boomed from the top of the gangway, amplified by the ship's PA system, echoing across the entire pier. It was a voice that tolerated no argument. Every sailor, every officer, every person in uniform froze and instinctively snapped to attention. Lieutenant Miller spun around, his hand dropping from Lawrence's shoulder as if it were on fire. His face went slack with confusion, and then with dawning terror. Marching down the gangway with a speed and purpose that was breathtaking to behold was Rear Admiral Blackwood himself. His face was a thundercloud of controlled fury, his dress white uniform immaculate, his chest a rainbow of valorous service. Flanking him were the ship's captain and his personal aide. Behind them, in perfect gleaming formation, marched 6 United States Marines in full ceremonial dress, their rifles held with practiced precision. The entire pier fell into a dead, shocked silence. The crowd, which had been a chaotic jumble of civilians and sailors, parted like the Red Sea. The spectacle was so sudden, so overwhelmingly official, that no one knew what to do except stare. Admiral Blackwood's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the cowering lieutenant, the confused master-at-arms, and finally the small, still figure of Lawrence Owens. The Admiral didn't slow his pace until he was 3 feet from Lawrence. He came to a perfect, rigid halt. He did not acknowledge the lieutenant or anyone else. His eyes, clear and filled with a profound, unmistakable reverence, were fixed only on the old man. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave through the assembled crowd, Admiral Blackwood raised his hand to his brow and delivered the sharpest, most heartfelt salute of his long and decorated career. "Mr. Owens." His voice rang out, clear and powerful for all to hear. "It is an honor, sir. A profound and humbling honor." At his signal, the captain, the aide, the Marine Honor Guard, and every other man and woman in uniform on that pier, including the 2 dumbstruck master-at-arms, snapped into a salute. The only uniformed person not saluting was Lieutenant Miller, who stood frozen, his mind unable to process what was happening. Admiral Blackwood held his salute for a long moment before slowly lowering his hand. He turned to face the silent, baffled crowd. "For those of you who do not know," he began, his voice resonating with the gravity of a history lesson, "you are in the presence of a giant. You are standing before Ensign Lawrence Owens, United States Navy retired." He paused, letting the name and rank sink in. In October of 1944, during the Battle of Samar, Mr. Owens was the junior-most officer on the bridge of the destroyer escort USS Courage. His ship, along with a handful of others in a unit codenamed Taffy 3, found themselves facing the entire Japanese center force, a fleet of battleships and heavy cruisers that should have annihilated them in minutes. They were outgunned, outmanned, and all but defenseless. The Admiral's gaze fell upon the young sailors in the crowd, his eyes willing them to understand. In the first salvo, a shell from the battleship Yamato struck the Courage's bridge, killing the captain and every senior officer instantly. The ship was on fire and sinking. Command fell to a 22-year-old ensign. This man, he gestured to Lawrence. With his ship shattered and his crew dying around him, Ensign Owens refused to retreat. He took command, rallied the survivors, and ordered his ship to charge directly at a line of Japanese cruisers. For 2 hours, he held them off, weaving through shell splashes, laying smoke, and firing his single remaining gun until it ran out of ammunition. His actions drew the fire of the heavy cruisers, allowing the small escort carriers he was protecting to escape. He saved hundreds of American lives that day, at the cost of his own ship and most of his crew. The Admiral stepped closer to Lawrence and gently indicated the small, dark object on his lapel. "Lieutenant Miller," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level as he finally addressed the young officer. "You asked what this was. This is not a prize from a bingo game. This is a piece of shrapnel from the Japanese cruiser Haguro. It was embedded in the bulkhead 2 inches from Mr. Owens's head. He keeps it not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the 87 shipmates he lost that day." A wave of awe and shame washed over the pier. The faces in the crowd, once just curious, were now filled with reverence. They were looking at Lawrence not as an old man, but as the living embodiment of the ship's name, Courage. Admiral Blackwood turned his full, wrathful attention to Lieutenant Miller, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure horror. The Admiral's voice was low, but each word was a hammer blow. "Lieutenant, you are an embarrassment to the uniform I wear, to the traditions I uphold, and to the memory of the men who died under Mr. Owens's command. You stand on a pier named for fallen heroes, serving on a ship christened in honor of Valor, and you saw nothing but a nuisance. You looked at this man and saw his age, not his sacrifice. You saw a worn-out jacket, not a hero's mantle. Your obsession with regulations has made you blind to the one thing that gives those regulations meaning: honor." The Admiral leaned in close. "You will report to my office at 0600 tomorrow morning. You will be relieved of your duties on this ship, and you will spend the remainder of your tour contemplating the difference between having authority and having honor." Dismissed. As the disgraced lieutenant stumbled away, his career in ruins, Lawrence Owens finally spoke. His voice was soft, yet it carried across the silent pier. "Admiral," he said, looking not at the retreating lieutenant but at the high-ranking officer before him. "He's just a boy, eager to do his job right. The failure isn't his alone. Maybe the regulations, the books we give them, have forgotten how to describe what real service looks like off the page." Lawrence then turned his calm, forgiving eyes toward the crowd. He gently touched the piece of shrapnel on his lapel. "Respect isn't in a rule book," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "It's in here." He tapped a finger over his heart. "You don't learn it by shouting. You learn it by listening to the stories of those who came before." As he touched the pin, another memory, sharper than the last, flashed in his mind. He wasn't on the bridge in the heart of the battle, but on a makeshift life raft days later, adrift in the vast empty Pacific. The sun beat down on his burned skin. He was clutching that same jagged piece of metal, still warm from the fires that had consumed his ship. He wasn't thinking of victory or heroism. He was thinking of the faces of his friends, his shipmates, now lost to the deep. The piece of metal wasn't a souvenir. It was a promise to remember them, a promise to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. In the aftermath, Lawrence Owens was escorted aboard the USS Courage, not as a guest but as a returning king. Admiral Blackwood himself gave him a personal tour, the crew lining the passageways to salute him as he passed. The story of what happened on the pier spread through the fleet like wildfire. Within a week, the Navy officially issued a formal public apology to Mr. Owens. Inspired and deeply shamed by the incident, Admiral Blackwood used his considerable influence to enact a new fleet-wide mandate. The Owens Initiative, as it came to be called, was a mandatory naval heritage program for all junior officers. It focused not on dates and battles but on the personal stories of living veterans, ensuring that the new generation of naval leadership would learn to see the hero behind the weathered face. The former Lieutenant Miller was not discharged. Instead, in a stroke of poetic justice, he was reassigned to a dreary desk job at a naval archive and tasked with organizing the curriculum for the very first Owens Initiative seminar. His punishment was not to be exiled, but to be educated, forced to learn the lesson he had so publicly and painfully failed. 6 months later, in a quiet diner in a small town hundreds of miles from the sea, Lawrence Owens was sitting in his usual booth, nursing a cup of coffee. The bell above the door chimed, and a young man in civilian clothes walked in. He looked different without his uniform, smaller and less sure of himself. He scanned the room, and his eyes landed on Lawrence. It was Miller. He hesitated for a long moment, then walked slowly to the booth. He stood by the table, his hands fidgeting. He didn't speak for a full minute. Then he went to the counter, bought a cup of coffee, and brought it back, placing it on the table in front of Lawrence. "Mr. Owens," he said, his voice quiet and choked with a humility he had not possessed before. "I just wanted to say thank you." Lawrence looked up from his cup, his eyes holding no trace of anger or resentment. He simply gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, a silent acceptance of an apology that needed no more words. The lesson had been learned. The circle was closed. The stories of heroes like Lawrence Owens remind us that valor is timeless, and that true respect is earned not by the rank on one's collar, but by the courage in one's heart. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with others, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more tales of unassuming heroes.